When I moved into my new lakefront home, I didn't expect to be confronted within hours, but sure enough, the self-appointed Ho Queen came storming over like she owned the whole shoreline. She zeroed in on my $15,000 dock like it was a personal insult. "That eyesore needs to be removed immediately," she demanded. Her name was Vivian Blackwell, and she was the president of the Lakeside Estates HOA. She warned me I had 48 hours to take the dock down, or she'd unleash her lawyers. Clearly, she thought I'd be just another pushover she could steamroll. What she didn't realize, my dock was 100% legal. Every single permit, inspection, and requirement had been met to the letter. Watching her stomp away back to her lakeside palace, I couldn't help but smirk because she had no clue who she just tried to strong-arm. Now, I've been resolving lakefront property disputes for over 15 years, so I thought I'd seen it all. But nothing prepared me for the showdown that took place that warm Saturday afternoon. Just imagine, I'd finally sealed the deal on my dream home after a grueling divorce. I had sunk every last dollar into this peaceful getaway, with the dock being the crown jewel. Built professionally, permitted thoroughly. It was the very reason I bought the place. As I was unloading the final kitchen box from my truck, already picturing myself relaxing on that dock, I heard the sharp sound of heels striking pavement like warning shots. Then came Vivian, marching up in what had to be a designer yoga outfit, scowling like I'd personally offended her. "Mr. Hernandez," she snapped, gesturing at my dock like it was hazardous waste, "we need to talk about that structure, immediately." Now, I had a choice to make. I could have shown her my credentials right then and there, told her I'm a county inspector, and watched her pale with realization. But instead, I decided to play along. Call it curiosity or just a bit of professional mischief. I wanted to see just how deep this rabbit hole went. I wiped my hands on my jeans, set down the box, and greeted her calmly. "What seems to be the issue with my dock?" She practically choked on her outrage. "That dock needs to go today. It's against HOA standards. It's ugly, out of place, and doesn't belong in a community like ours." The way she emphasized ours rubbed me the wrong way, like she didn't just mean the dock didn't belong, she meant me, too. Still, I kept my cool. Dealing with difficult property owners has taught me the value of patience. "Well, I've got all the required county approvals," I said, showing her the permits on my phone. "Everything's up to code." She barely glanced at the screen before brushing it off with a dismissive wave. "I don't care about your county paperwork. HOA rules take precedence here. We have our own standards." That's when it clicked. She didn't have a clue what she was talking about. HOA covenants don't override county laws. That's not how the legal system works. But beyond the legal nonsense, I got a crystal clear picture of who I was dealing with: someone who believed rules were for everyone else. Someone who enjoyed throwing their weight around just to see people squirm. "I hear you," I said calmly, "but everything I've done is fully compliant with county law, inspected, and documented. I haven't broken any rules." That's when she stepped even closer, eyes gleaming like she was enjoying this little power trip. "You have 48 hours to take the dock down," she said, practically spitting out my last name like it was an insult. "If it's still there Monday morning, we'll take legal action. And believe me, you don't want to mess with this HOA. We have resources." As she strutted back to her house, likely patting herself on the back for a job well done, I spotted something that made my blood pressure spike. Her own dock. It was massive, practically a floating resort, and from my spot on the shore, I could already see 3 violations. No posted permit, no inspection sticker, no setback measurements. The irony was almost laughable. She was threatening my legal structure while her own dock was practically begging to be reported. And little did she know she had picked a fight with the one person who could shut her entire setup down in a heartbeat. By the time Monday arrived, I hadn't even started my full inspection, but I already had a list of violations on her precious build. That's the thing about bullies, they assume everyone else is as careless and crooked as they are. Just as I finished my coffee that morning, I noticed a sealed envelope stuck to my front door. It had violation notice stamped in giant red letters, as if I'd committed some federal offense. "All right, Vivian," I thought, "let's see what kind of nonsense you've pulled this time." To her credit, she'd at least attempted to sound official. The letter claimed I had violated some obscure HOA clause buried deep in their covenant documents, as something about architectural uniformity. According to the letter, any exterior additions or structures needed prior approval from the board to ensure they matched the neighborhood's aesthetic guidelines. And to be fair, she wasn't entirely wrong, as this obscure rule was buried deep in subsection 14.3 of the original HOA covenants, dating all the way back to 1992, the kind of fine print no normal person would think to check. But someone like Vivian, a former real estate agent who thrived on technicalities, she knew exactly where to look and how to use it as a weapon. So, I decided to beat her at her own game. I spent all of Tuesday assembling what could only be described as the most detailed architectural review submission the HOA had ever seen. We're talking everything from architectural blueprints and soil surveys to environmental impact statements and aerial drone photos at every conceivable angle, every justification, every document. I even included a professional write-up explaining how my doc actually enhanced the appearance of the neighborhood and boosted property values. Honestly, it was the kind of submission that would have made any city planning department proud. So how long do you think it took for Vivian to reject it? Less than 24 hours. I didn't even get a full business day before I got the classic thanks, but no thanks response. The rejection letter was a masterpiece in vague corporate lingo, something about aesthetic non-compliance and threats to neighborhood character. No specific issues mentioned, no feedback, no suggestions for changes. Just a flat-out denial, along with a note that the board wasn't obligated to explain its decisions, which, for the record, is total nonsense under state HOA laws. But I wasn't ready to pull that lever just yet. That's when I realized something. This wasn't just pushback. Vivian wasn't just making things hard, as she was intentionally crossing legal lines. And now, it was personal. Wednesday morning, I opened the door to find a county code enforcement officer standing on my porch with a clipboard. Apparently, I was being cited for multiple violations: my work truck, illegally parked on my own property, my electrical tools, suddenly considered a safety hazard, noise complaints, filed about me working too early, before 8 a.m. All anonymous reports, all submitted in the last 48 hours, all clearly coming from the same bitter source. And that's what really got under my skin, not the harassment, not the bogus violations, but the sheer audacity of it. Vivian took one look at me and saw what she wanted to see: some working-class guy with a toolbox and no legal know-how, someone she could intimidate, bully, and bury in red tape until I caved. But what she didn't realize is that being a professional investigator teaches you to notice things while you're under attack, and the more I examined her doc with a critical eye, the more problems became obvious. That thing jutted at least 15 feet past the legal boundary, well into the navigation zone. The pilings, almost certainly installed without proper geological studies or permits. The wiring looked like it had been done by a weekend hobbyist, not a certified marine electrician. And most damning of all, there wasn't a single posted permit visible anywhere on the structure. So that Thursday, I'm out on my dock with a measuring tape, not just to document the harassment trail, but because I was genuinely curious just how deep her violations went. That's when I met Betty. She shuffled over from the house next door, an older woman with kind eyes and a smile that instantly made me feel like I'd lived there for years. "You must be the new guy," she said warmly. "I'm Betty Morrison, been here 2 decades. And I've got to say, it's nice seeing someone finally stand up to her." Turns out, Betty had stories. Lots of them. Apparently, Vivian had pulled the exact same stunt on the Johnsons, a friendly couple who owned a little fishing boat. Vivian decided their boat lift didn't meet her high standards and made their lives unbearable until they finally sold their home and left. That was 2 years ago, and the house sat empty for months after because word had gotten around about how toxic the HOA had become under her leadership. But then Betty said something that made every alarm in my head go off. She had that dock of hers built almost overnight, maybe 3 years ago. I remember it clearly because the construction crews woke up the whole street for a week straight. Big crews, loud machines, lots of early morning hammering. And the best part? She added, leaning in like she was about to spill a secret, the HOA paid for the whole thing. said it was emergency storm damage repair. I blinked. Storm damage? She nodded. That's what she claimed. But we barely got a drizzle that month, nothing even close to storm level. Still, she pushed it through as an emergency repair, $25,000 straight from the HOA emergency fund. Now I was really listening. Betty told me she was still on the board back then and remembered the amount exactly. She thought it was suspicious at the time why that much money for repairs when there hadn't been any storm, but Vivian insisted it was too urgent to wait for normal approval channels. And there it was, standing on my perfectly legal, fully permitted dock. I stared across the water at Vivian's so-called emergency repair and knew something wasn't right, because here's the truth. Emergency repairs can bypass certain HOA procedures, sure, but they can't skip county permits, they can't skip inspections, and they absolutely require documented proof of the event that caused the emergency in the first place. And the only thing that storm ever damaged was the HOA budget and maybe, just maybe, Vivian's credibility. You know what actually qualifies as an emergency repair? Real, tangible damage, something caused by a legitimate event like a storm. And let's just say, Vivian had absolutely none of that. How long do you think it'll take before she realizes she didn't just poke the bear? She declared war on the one person capable of dismantling her entire operation from the inside out. Ever experienced HOA drama like this? Let Echo Stories know in the comments and tell us where you're tuning in from. By Friday morning, I decided enough was enough. The whole week, I'd kept my cool while Vivian ramped up her antics, quietly collecting evidence every time she stepped over the line. But the truth is, I was done playing along. No more pretending I didn't have options. It was time to flip the script. So, I filed an official report. I launched a county investigation into suspected violations of waterfront construction laws writing lakeside estates. And guess whose dock was first on the checklist? The advantage of being a senior inspector for the county's waterway division is that I don't need anyone's blessing to start looking into questionable structures. No HOA authorization, no advance notice, just credible cause to believe something's off. And after Betty's bombshell about the so-called emergency dock repairs, yeah, I had plenty of cause. I rolled up that Monday morning in my marked county vehicle, big, white, and impossible to miss. Waterway enforcement was printed in bold letters across the side, large enough to be read from across the lake. And sure enough, before I even stepped out of the truck, I noticed Vivian's curtains twitching. She was watching. I set up my equipment right there: clipboard, official forms, camera, measuring tools, even a water testing kit. This was no longer some neighborhood feud. This was now a full-fledged county investigation. And it quickly became clear, her emergency dock was an outright disaster. First off, the structure extended a full 22 feet past the legal boundary, jutting directly into a protected navigation channel. The pilings, installed without any kind of soil assessment, creating a potential erosion hazard. The electrical setup didn't just violate marine code, it was flat-out dangerous. And worst of all, the entire structure had been built atop county-owned lakebed without a lease, an environmental review, or any paperwork. But the icing on the cake, when I checked the construction dates against county weather records, Betty's story held up flawlessly. The month Vivian claimed her dock was destroyed by a storm, according to official data, the weather was practically perfect, not even a mild thunderstorm, just a few light showers. So, either there was no damage at all or Vivian had falsified the timeline. Either way, we were dealing with a lie. I spent over 3 hours combing through every detail and violation I could find. When I returned to the county office, I dove straight into the records. And since HOA spending becomes public record when it involves emergency funding, it didn't take long to find the red flag I was expecting. There it was, a $25,000 payment made out to Morrison Construction, marked as reimbursement for emergency storm damage repairs to the community dock. The kicker, the invoice stayed aligned perfectly with the same sunny, storm-free week on file. And guess who signed off on it? Vivian Blackwell, HOA president. She'd used her position to authorize an emergency payout, bypassing the board's normal approval process. When I called Morrison Construction to ask about the job, the guy on the phone didn't even try to hide his discomfort. "Oh, that dock job," he muttered. "Yeah, broken bar, that one was different. The lady told us it was all cleared by the HOA, that permits were taken care of through some emergency fast-track system. They never saw any damage, he admitted. Just a claim that the dock was structurally compromised and had to be replaced immediately. His voice dropped to a near whisper. To be honest, we always thought something seemed off, but she paid everything up front in cash and insisted it was all legal. By Wednesday, I had more than enough evidence to bring the case to the county prosecutor. But before going nuclear, I figured I'd give her one last shot to come clean, out of courtesy, if nothing else. So I ditched the uniform, threw on some casual clothes, and walked over to her place in just a couple of neighbors chatting on a sunny afternoon. I knocked on her door. She yanked it open before I could even say a word, practically snarling. "What do you want now?" Gone was the polished, passive-aggressive president act. What stood there was someone who knew she was cornered. "I'd like to talk about your dock," I said, keeping my tone neutral. "There are a few inconsistencies in the permitting records I wanted to discuss." Her face cycled through an entire slideshow of emotion to confusion, then denial, then panic, then back to righteous anger. "You have no authority to harass me about my property," she snapped. "I'll have you charged with trespassing." That was my cue. I calmly pulled out my county badge and held it up where she couldn't miss it. "Actually, I have every authority in the book. I'm Luis Hernandez, Senior Waterway Inspector for the county, and your dock violates at least a dozen environmental and construction ordinances." I watched the blood drain from her face. "You're the inspector? But I thought a broken bar you're just that electrician guy with the truck." I almost laughed. "No, Vivian, I'm the guy who helped write the very regulations you've been ignoring, and I live here now." I let that sink in for a second before continuing. "I'm also the person who can and will shut down your entire dock with a single phone call." She tried to recover, tried to claw back some control. "This is harassment, retaliation. I'll sue you for abuse of power." But we both knew the game was over. "You're welcome to file a complaint," I said, handing her my county-issued business card. "But you might want to hire a lawyer instead, because starting next week, you'll be receiving formal citations from 3 separate departments." And with that, I turned and walked away, leaving her standing in the doorway of her oversized, illegally built dock, knowing full well the hammer was about to drop. The following week, things took a serious turn. I watched from across the street as Vivian, clearly rattled, paced in front of her window, rapidly dialing numbers on her phone. She was probably calling her attorney husband, maybe reaching out to Morrison Construction, or anyone who might help her claw her way out of the hole she'd been digging for years. But here's the truth about digging yourself into a hole: at some point, it's too deep to climb out of. Vivian had spent 3 years digging down, and now she had nowhere left to go but up. But what happens when the predator realizes they've been stalking the wrong prey? The look on her face said it all, and the fear in her eyes was something I won't soon forget. Tuesday morning, exactly 1 week after our little chat on her doorstep, she received her first official county violation notice, delivered in person by a process server and taped right onto her front door in a glaring yellow envelope for the entire neighborhood to see. I happened to be checking my mailbox at that exact moment. The timing was perfect. Her reaction, like someone who just discovered they'd stepped right onto a live grenade. Later that day, my son Diego arrived from college. He'd planned a regular visit, but I'd also given him a heads up about the neighborhood situation. I figured it might be smart to have a witness. Diego's studying criminal justice, so he's got a sharp sense for legal tension. When he saw Vivian pacing like a trapped animal in her yard, shouting into her phone, he just turned to me and asked, "Dad, what exactly did you do to that woman?" "Nothing illegal," I said. "I just did my job." That's when Vivian made her first major misstep. She came walking over to my place, a forced smile plastered across her face, like the last week had just been a bad dream. "Luis," she greeted me with an exaggerated cheer, like we were old pals. "I think there's been a bit of a misunderstanding. Maybe we can resolve this like reasonable neighbors." The desperation in her voice was impossible to miss. She offered to push through my dock approval immediately, waive the application fees, even cover the costs for any upgrades I might want to make, anything to make this go away. She talked for a solid 5 minutes straight, each word more revealing than the last. It was like watching a car crash in slow motion. Here was someone who had gone out of her way to make my life hell, now tripping over herself to buy her way out of trouble. Once she realized I held all the power. When she finally paused, I responded calmly, "Vivian, my dock has always been in compliance. It was fully permitted and approved long before you ever made this personal. The issue here isn't with my dock, it's with yours." She tried to cut me off, but I didn't stop. I listed it all out: fraudulent insurance claims, unauthorized construction, multiple violations of shoreline regulations, environmental infractions, and improper use of emergency HOA funds. And then she made her second big mistake. She leaned in slightly, lowered her voice, and said, "What if I gave you $50,000 to make this disappear?" She glanced over her shoulder, as if worried someone might overhear. "Cash, no paper trail, we just forget the whole thing." Diego's jaw hit the floor. I couldn't help it and laughed. "Vivian," I said, shaking my head, "you just tried to bribe a senior county inspector. That's a felony. And, by the way, my son is studying criminal justice. He just witnessed it." The very next day, the neighborhood started to buzz. County trucks began rolling in one by one. Inspectors, environmental compliance agents, even a fraud investigator, all of them paying Vivian's house a visit. By Thursday morning, it looked like her property was hosting a government convention. But the real show, that was Thursday night at the emergency HOA board meeting. The meeting had been officially called to discuss recent community concerns, but everyone knew exactly what was on the agenda. The community center was overflowing. 40, maybe 50 residents packed inside, eager to understand why their HOA president was now under a swarm of county scrutiny. I arrived with a well-organized folder. Inside were photos of the dock, copies of the violation notices, financial records showing the fraudulent expenditures, and county weather data proving no storm had ever occurred. When the board's secretary asked for an update, I finally stood and introduced myself to the neighborhood formally this time. "Good evening. My name is Luis Hernandez. I'm your neighbor a broken bar, and I also happen to be the senior waterway inspector for the county." You could have heard a pin drop. That was the moment 40 people realized I wasn't just some random guy with a work truck. I was the one who could shut down half their waterfront access with a single order. "And Vivian?" She looked like she was about to collapse. I presented everything without commentary, just facts: the fake insurance claims, the illegal build, the environmental risks, the misused community funds. When I finished, there was dead silence for a beat, and then chaos. People talking over one another, residents demanding answers, board members scrambling to distance themselves from Vivian. And then Betty Morrison stood up and sealed Vivian's fate. "I was on the board when that dock was built," she said to the room. "I remember questioning the emergency expenditure, but Vivian insisted it was a matter of safety. Now I know why she pushed it through so fast. She knew it wouldn't survive a proper review, because it was never legal in the first place." The room erupted in chaos. Longtime residents, who had faithfully paid their HOA dues for years, were just beginning to grasp that their money had been funneled into an illegal project that jeopardized the entire community. The board's response was immediate and absolute: a unanimous vote, 8-0. With Vivian excluded since she'd already lost her voting rights. She was removed from her position as HOA president on the spot, pending a full forensic audit. The board also ordered complete repayment of misappropriated funds and referred the matter to law enforcement for a formal criminal investigation. It was fast, final, and utterly devastating for someone who had spent years building her identity around being in control. As the crowd filed out of the community center, Vivian made one last attempt to claw back some control. In the parking lot, she stormed up to me and hissed through clenched teeth, "This isn't over. My husband's an attorney. He'll tear you apart for this. You're going to wish you'd never moved here." I met her glare calmly. "Vivian," I said, "your husband is smart enough to protect his career by separating himself from your mess. And the only thing I regret is not making my role clear the day I arrived. Could have saved everyone a lot of grief." That night, Diego drove us home. He shook his head, still stunned. "Dad," he said, "I've never seen someone crash and burn that fast. It was like watching someone step on the gas and drive off a cliff." I told him that's what happens when people start believing their own hype. They confuse power with immunity. Forget that responsibility comes with consequences and that no matter how big you think you are, there's always someone bigger in the pond. By Friday morning, karma arrived in full force. I was sitting on my dock, coffee in hand, my fully legal, permitted, and compliant dock when the county demolition crew rolled up in front of Vivian's place. Massive trucks, industrial equipment and the whole production. You'd think they were taking down a high-rise, not just an illegal dock. But when someone racks up as many violations as she had, the county doesn't do subtle. The 48-hour demolition notice had been posted earlier in the week, right alongside a growing collection of official warnings plastered on her door: red for fire code infractions, yellow for environmental damage, blue for zoning violations, and now a bold orange order for immediate removal. Her front porch looked more like a municipal bulletin board than the entrance to a HOA, like a holiday display. If the holiday was Consequences Day, Vivian tried to stop the inevitable. She bolted out of her house in a bathrobe and slippers, waving what looked like a last-minute legal document, probably something her husband had thrown together overnight. "You can't do this," she screamed at the demolition foreman. "I have an injunction. I have rights." The foreman, clearly no stranger to last-minute theatrics, barely looked up. He handed her a clipboard and pointed to the line. "Ma'am, this is a safety enforcement order. Your structure poses environmental and navigational hazards. It's coming down today." By noon, Vivian's $25,000 emergency repair was reduced to a pile of splintered boards bobbing in the water, awaiting cleanup. The whole neighborhood came out to watch, not in a spiteful way, more like a crowd witnessing a long overdue reckoning. Parents explained to kids what was happening. People snapped photos, not out of malice, but because it felt like closure. And then came the financial fallout. Within days, Vivian was hit with invoices totaling $58,000, $8,000 for demolition, $25,000 to reimburse the HOA fund, $15,000 for environmental remediation, $10,000 in various county fines, and that doesn't even touch the legal bills stacking up as she tried to dig herself out of a hole she couldn't win in court. But the most significant damage, her personal life. By Thursday afternoon, a moving truck showed up at her husband's law office. That evening, most of his belongings had vanished from the house. Turns out, Robert Blackwell had the foresight to protect his career. The next morning, divorce papers were filed citing financial misconduct and irreconcilable differences, which, in legal terms, basically says, "My wife broke the law, and I'm not going down with her." Meanwhile, Morrison Construction was quick to cooperate with a fraud investigation. They handed over all their correspondence with Vivian, the phony storm damage reports she'd pushed them to submit, and even testified that she'd explicitly told them to bypass the permitting process. When your own contractors start throwing you under the bus to save themselves, you know you're in serious trouble. The insurance company didn't waste time either. By Monday, they had frozen all of Vivian's policies, demanded immediate repayment of the $25,000 claim, and filed for recovery of further damages. Insurance fraud is a line you don't cross lightly. These companies don't just punish, they make examples. By Tuesday morning, the local news had picked up the story. Our quiet neighborhood drama exploded into a headline-grabbing scandal. 3 different networks led with variations of the same story. HOA president accused of dock scam, accompanied by aerial footage of the demolition and interviews with neighbors sharing their experiences under Vivian's abusive leadership. I gave a brief interview to kept it professional, focused strictly on facts. The room exploded in outrage. Residents who had faithfully paid their HOA dues for years suddenly realized they'd been unknowingly funding an illegal construction project, one that exposed the entire neighborhood to legal consequences. The board's vote was unanimous, 8 in favor of immediate action, none against. Vivian abstained, though technically she'd already lost her voting privileges due to prior suspension. Effective immediately, she was stripped of her role as HOA president, a comprehensive audit was ordered, and full restitution of misappropriated funds was mandated. The matter was also referred to the proper legal authorities for criminal investigation. The decision was fast, firm, and devastating, especially for someone whose entire persona revolved around exerting control over others. As residents exited the community center, Vivian made one final, desperate attempt to cling to some shred of power. Cornering me in the parking lot, she snarled, "This isn't the end. My husband's a lawyer. He'll bury you for this. You'll regret ever setting foot in this neighborhood." I met her glare with a calm voice. "Vivian, your husband is smart enough to protect his legal career by cutting ties with your actions. And frankly, my only regret is not revealing who I was sooner. It would have spared everyone a lot of grief." That night, Diego drove me home, still in disbelief. "Dad, I've never seen anyone crash and burn that fast. She practically jumped off a cliff." I told him, "That's what happens when people get intoxicated by their own authority. They forget they're not the biggest player in the room. They forget leadership is a duty, not a toy. And worst of all, they forget their actions carry real consequences." Friday morning delivered justice so satisfying, it almost felt surreal. I was sipping coffee on my dock, my fully legal, permitted dock, when the county's demolition crew rolled up in front of Vivian's property. Massive trucks, heavy machinery. It looked like a small army was preparing to raise a skyscraper, but all that firepower was aimed at a single, unlawfully constructed dock. Given how many regulations Vivian had disregarded, the county wasn't about to go easy. The 48-hour demolition notice had been plastered to her front door days earlier, joining the growing stack of violation warnings in every color of fire code: red, environmental impact yellow, zoning blue, and now bright orange for urgent structural removal. Her entrance looked more like a government bulletin board than a front door or an official paper trail of her misdeeds. Then came the spectacle. Vivian burst out of her house in a bathrobe and slippers, flailing a document she claimed her husband whipped up overnight. "You can't do this!" she shrieked at the demolition foreman. "I've got an injunction. I have rights." The foreman, clearly no stranger to scenes like this, handed her a clipboard and calmly replied, "Ma'am, this is a county safety directive. Your structure is an environmental and navigational hazard. It's coming down today." By noon, the $25,000 dock was nothing but shattered planks drifting aimlessly in the water, waiting for cleanup. Most of the neighborhood had gathered to watch, not out of malice, but because it was the first time in years they'd seen accountability in action. Kids pointed in curiosity. Adults snapped photos. For once, the community could breathe freely. The financial fallout came hard and fast. Within the week, Vivian received bills totaling nearly $60,088,000 for demolition, $25,000 to replenish the HOA's emergency fund, $15,000 for environmental remediation, and another $10,000 in various fines. And that didn't even include legal fees she was racking up while trying to defend the indefensible. But her personal life was unraveling even faster. By Thursday afternoon, a moving truck pulled up outside her husband's office, and by nightfall, most of his belongings were gone from the house. Robert Blackwell had clearly decided to protect his career by severing all ties. The separation was made official Friday, citing irreconcilable differences and financial misconduct. Legal code for, "She's on her own." Meanwhile, Morrison Construction began cooperating fully with investigators. They handed over email trails, fake damage reports Vivian had pressured them to file, and sworn statements confirming she'd ordered them to bypass proper permits. When your contractors start turning you in to save their own licenses, you're in serious trouble. The insurance company wasted no time either. By Monday, all of Vivian's policies were frozen pending the fraud investigation. They demanded repayment of the $25,000 claim and launched their own lawsuit for further damages. Insurance fraud isn't something these companies take lightly, as they've got entire teams dedicated to punishing offenders. Then the story went public. By Tuesday morning, every local news outlet had picked it up. HOA president charged in dock fraud scandal led the evening broadcasts. Helicopters filmed the demolition. Neighbors shared their experiences of living under her tyrannical rule. Even I was interviewed, though I kept it focused on the importance of responsible waterfront regulation and not personal vindication. What truly shocked me, though, was how fast the community started healing once she was gone. Betty Morrison was unanimously chosen as interim HOA president, and her first move was implementing full transparency. For the first time in years, Financial documents were accessible online. Meeting minutes weren't just vague notes, they were detailed records of every vote and conversation. It felt like democracy had finally returned. 2 weeks of environmental cleanup revealed even more violations. Her dock had been leaking harmful chemicals into the water for 3 years. The pilings had been driven through protected wetlands. Her electrical setup was leaking current into the lake, dangerous for swimmers and wildlife alike. Each new discovery brought more fines, higher cleanup costs, and deeper legal problems. When the full environmental report came in, Vivian's total financial liability had climbed past $100,000. For someone whose self-worth was tied entirely to status and wealth, this was total collapse. Meanwhile, my dock became a gathering place. Neighbors who once avoided public spaces out of fear started coming by to talk, to fish, just to enjoy the water. Children swam freely again. It felt like a long, collective exhale after years of tension. The county started using our case as a model. I gave presentations on HOA oversight and waterfront regulation to officials from other towns. Dozens of communities followed suit, uncovering and correcting violations they didn't even know existed. 3 weeks after Vivian's dock came down, the county manager called. They offered me a promotion to Chief Waterway Enforcement Officer. He told me, "You didn't just stop an environmental hazard. You recovered stolen funds, strengthened your community, and upheld public trust." That's the kind of leadership we need. But the biggest twist was yet to come. What the community uncovered next would be even more explosive than anything I'd found. Criminal charges hit like a slow-motion avalanche. First, a felony indictment for insurance fraud, up to 5 years in prison and a $50,000 fine. Then came embezzlement charges tied to the HOA funds, another serious felony. Finally, environmental crime charges for knowingly polluting public waters, which carried mandatory restitution. Watching her arraignment was like witnessing a life unravel, and fast forward, the woman who once ruled with fear now stood in court, hollow-eyed and wearing a cheap suit provided by a public defender. Her husband hadn't just filed for divorce, he'd cut her off entirely. The court-appointed lawyer looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. News coverage was relentless. Every day brought new revelations. Investigative journalists unearthed her history of power abuse. 3 families had been forced out of the neighborhood due to her bullying. Thousands of dollars in unauthorized expenses showed up in HOA accounts. She'd violated open meeting laws, conducted secret board sessions, and buried financial records. It was a corruption onion, layer after foul layer. Then came the real bombshell. The county prosecutor announced they were expanding the investigation to include tax fraud. Vivian had been claiming the dock as a business expense for her husband's law firm, writing off the entire $25,000 cost as client entertainment. The IRS does not appreciate that kind of creativity. Plea deals were offered, then yanked back. Her lawyer pleaded for leniency, citing mental health struggles and a clean criminal record. But the paper trail was ironclad. Insurance investigators showed repeated fraud. Environmental officers had photographic proof she ignored stop work orders. HOA audits revealed systematic theft. Meanwhile, the community was learning just how deeply she'd manipulated things. Betty Morrison's audit uncovered years of low-level theft of phony invoices, padded contractor bills, even charging personal meals to the HOA card and calling them business expenses. The social fallout was just as brutal. Vivian, once the self-proclaimed queen of the neighborhood, became a pariah. People crossed the street to avoid her. Social clubs quietly cut ties. Even her book club voted to remove her after the criminal charges became public. And the divorce? That turned ugly fast. Robert Blackwell wasn't just securing his law firm's future, he was actively working to distance himself from his wife's criminal mess. Court records showed he claimed to have had no idea about the illegal dock project, despite living in the same house while it was being built. In statements to investigators, he portrayed Vivian as a compulsive deceiver, keeping her unlawful schemes hidden even from her closest family. Within 2 months of the charges being filed, foreclosure notices appeared on the property. The combined weight of legal fees, fines, court-ordered restitution, and environmental cleanup costs had drained their finances completely. With their joint accounts frozen pending criminal proceedings, Vivian was left with almost nothing, scraping by on whatever part-time work she could find. The sentencing hearing was almost surreal. I was asked to speak on behalf of the community during the victim impact statement. Facing me was a shell of the once overbearing woman who had ruled our neighborhood through fear. She looked gaunt, her hair was a mess, and she appeared utterly exhausted physically and emotionally. It was hard to find satisfaction in her downfall, even knowing it was fully earned. The judge handed down a sentence of 18 months probation rather than jail, but with strict requirements: full repayment of all embezzled funds, mandatory community service focusing on environmental restoration, regular probation check-ins, and a permanent prohibition from holding any HOA position again. The restitution alone amounted to over $90,000, an amount that would take years to repay, assuming she could maintain any form of stable employment. But perhaps the most poetic form of justice came in the form of her community service via 120 hours of supervised cleanup work with the county's water resources team. She'd be restoring damaged habitats, including the one her illegal dock had polluted. The irony was so sharp, it almost felt deliberate. Half a year after her sentencing, I wouldn't have recognized her if we passed on the street. Vivian was living in a modest apartment on the other side of town, working part-time in retail, slowly chipping away at the debt she owed the community. Her transformation from tyrannical HOA president to a humbled, struggling civilian was complete. Meanwhile, our neighborhood was thriving under honest leadership. Property values actually climbed, spurred by the newfound transparency and trust in the HOA. The lakefront was cleaner and safer than it had been in years. New families moved into homes that had long been vacant, once abandoned by residents fleeing Vivian's reign of intimidation. The entire area had come alive again. My dock, once a point of contention, had become a symbol of resilience. Neighbors gathered there for casual chats, fishing, and spontaneous barbecues. Kids splashed in the water, laughter replacing the silence that had once hung heavy over the shoreline. The community was healing, its spirit restored. We had proven that standing up to bullies works, that the system, when used correctly, could deliver justice, and that progress doesn't require power, it requires courage. As I sat on my dock one evening, watching the sun paint the water gold, I thought about how differently things could have gone if Vivian had simply chosen integrity over control. But some people never learn that real strength lies in uplifting others, not tearing them down. How far did Vivian fall? Let's just say, karma knows exactly when and where to strike. If you think that was justice served, share your own stories in the comments below. Then, 6 months after the sentencing, I received a phone call that made everything worth it. The county manager was on the line, offering me a promotion to Chief Waterway Enforcement Officer. He cited the way I'd handled what he described as the most professionally managed enforcement action the county had ever seen. Apparently, my methodical, by-the-book approach had made quite an impression. Rather than letting personal anger guide the investigation, I had followed protocol, documented thoroughly, and trusted the system to do its job. The promotion came with a generous raise, expanded oversight, and a new role mentoring other inspectors on best practices for environmental enforcement. But what truly meant the most to me was that our neighborhood's battle had become an example for others. Across the region and even another county, our case was being studied and shared as a model for dealing with HOA corruption. It showed how one person, standing firm and doing things the right way, could spark a complete transformation. In fact, the county even featured my dock in their promotional materials about responsible shoreline development. It was now a textbook example of how to build a compliant, beautiful, and community-friendly waterfront structure. Tour groups of officials from other municipalities would occasionally stop by to see the dock that started it all. I usually made myself scarce. This was never about personal recognition. What had taken root in our neighborhood was something much more important. Under Betty Morrison's leadership, the HOA had become a symbol of transparency and democracy in action. Every meeting was now recorded and made publicly available. Financial statements were updated monthly and accessible to all residents. Major decisions required approval from the broader community, not just a handful of board members. It was like witnessing a regime give way to a true democracy. Since Vivian's departure, property values had risen by 12%, a clear indicator of how deeply trust and leadership affect a community's quality of life. The neighborhood had found its way back to itself. The community's turnaround wasn't just due to improved HOA practices, it was also because prospective home buyers knew they wouldn't have to contend with a power-hungry president anymore. Real estate agents had begun using our neighborhood as a shining example of how a homeowners association should function. Within just a year, the damage Vivian had done to our reputation had been completely undone. That spring, Diego graduated and accepted a job with the county prosecutor's office. He told me over dinner, "Dad, your case was like a textbook example of how justice should be handled, a careful investigation, the right procedures, consequences that fit the crime, and a chance for actual change, not just punishment." And he was right. Even Vivian, in her own way, was learning from her mistakes, taking steps to rebuild her life with a bit more honesty. I'd occasionally spot her around town during her community service shifts. The change was undeniable. The bitter, power-hungry woman who once made life miserable for us had been replaced by someone who looked focused, maybe even humbled. She was learning about water quality protection, assisting with environmental cleanup, and appeared to genuinely grasp the harm she had caused. It wasn't some dramatic takedown, it was better. It was accountability in action. Our annual dock celebration had become a cherished local tradition. What started as a casual get-together to reclaim our shoreline had evolved into a full-on community festival. Dozens of families came out for BBQs, swimming, fishing, and an evening of lakeside relaxation free from the fear of fines or power trips. Kids who had once been banned from playing near the water were now building sandcastles and catching minnows like nothing had ever happened. That fall, a local news station ran a follow-up segment on how our neighborhood had bounced back. They spoke with families who'd moved into homes once left vacant during the HOA's darkest days. All of them told similar stories. They were drawn by the natural beauty, but stayed because of the transparency and fairness they experienced here. One couple said they'd moved specifically because they'd heard how we stood up to corruption and won. My bond with Diego had only deepened throughout the ordeal. Watching me stand up to someone like Vivian and do it the right way had clearly left a lasting impression. On a fishing trip, he said, "You could have crushed her from the beginning, but instead, you let her destroy herself. That's what real strength looks like." The environmental recovery of our lakefront surpassed all expectations. With the illegal dock removed and proper restoration measures completed, the water quality improved dramatically. Fish came back, aquatic plants thrived, and the whole ecosystem was healthier than it had been in years. Our case became a clear example of how environmental enforcement done right could make a visible difference. Other lakefront communities began requesting inspections too, leading to dozens of additional violations being corrected across the region. My department even implemented new preventative protocols to catch environmental risks early. What started as one local case ended up boosting water quality across multiple counties. As I sat on my dock one quiet evening, watching the sun set over clear water and a calm neighborhood, I thought about how far we'd come. Vivian had tried to throw her weight around, thinking no one would challenge her authority. What she didn't know was that the person she picked a fight with had more power than she ever imagined. In the end, her fall wasn't because I wanted revenge, it was simply her own illegal behavior catching up to her. I just happened to be in the right place, with the right tools, when she made the mistake of pushing too far. 6 months later, I was still enjoying that dock, now as the senior waterway supervisor who helped turn around not just one community, but a whole region. And Vivian, she found out what happens when you threaten the person who literally writes the rules you're breaking. What still makes me smile, though, is this: she never once asked what I did for a living. If she had, this entire situation might have ended very differently. The takeaway: always know who you're picking a fight with. Some neighbors are just average folks, others can legally shut down your entire operation. That's the story here at HOA Stories. Sometimes karma hits hard, right where it counts, and sometimes, justice takes its time, but arrives all the same. If watching this HOA tyrant get her comeuppance gave you a little satisfaction, go ahead and hit that like button. I'm your host, and I'll catch you in the next video where we explore yet another wild tale of justice served. Until then, stay strong, stay honest, and keep standing up for what's right.